the threat of World War III, but most people in the Western world don't really seem to care. Michael Snyder reports, the Russians just told us again that the world could soon be facing a nuclear war if Western powers don't stop escalating the conflicts in Ukraine, but this is yet another warning that has gone in one ear and out the other. The Russians can talk about nuclear war until they are blue in the face, but nothing that they say is going to sink in because our leaders simply do not care. They're entirely convinced that the Russians will never use nuclear weapons, and so they're not afraid to keep pushing the Russians closer to a breaking point. And when the Russians finally reach their breaking point, what will they do? Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been playing this game for decades, and he always chooses his words very carefully. So when he publicly brings up the possibility of nuclear war, that is a really big deal. The following comes from an article that was posted on Yahoo News entitled, Russia Warns the United States of the Risks of World War III. We're now confirming once again that playing with fire, and they are like small children playing with matches, is a very dangerous thing for grown-up uncles and aunts who are entrusted with nuclear weapons in one or another Western country, Lavrov told reporters in Moscow. Lavrov said Americans unequivocally associate conversations about Third World War as something that, God forbid if it happens, will affect Europe exclusively. Lavrov added that Russia was clarifying its nuclear doctrine. Obviously, the Russians do not want a nuclear war. But unlike the US, the Russians have been feverishly preparing to fight one, and today their strategic nuclear arsenal and their anti-missile systems are far superior to our own. Most Americans don't realize this. I have been writing about this for years, but most people in the Western world are not interested in such warnings. And the Russians are also very clearly understand that whoever strikes first will have the best chance of surviving a nuclear conflict. Over and over, the Russians have made it clear that they would very much prefer to avoid using nuclear weapons, but the Russians have told us over and over that if they are pushing too far, they will use them. If they're pushed too far, they'll use them. Right now, the Russians are extremely angry. We saw more evidence of this when they just launched the largest assault on Ukraine, and they had a massive missile and drone attack aimed at infrastructure across Ukraine at the start of the week. It was the biggest air assault since the conflict began. And most of this in more than 2.5 years of conflict, according to Ukrainian Air Force Commander Mykola Oleshchuk. And the reason why the Russians are so angry is due to Ukraine's surprise invasion of Russia's lightly populated Kursk region. 3 weeks ago, Ukraine's military launched a stunning operation to take the conflict in Ukraine back onto the territory of the country that launched it, to Russia, that is. 3 weeks later, the Ukrainians still occupy hundreds of miles of territory in Russia's western Kursk region. The incursion had a number of goals: to force Russia to divert its forces from Ukraine, to defend its own towns and cities, to seize territory that might later be used for bargaining leverage in peace negotiations, and to send a political message to the Russian people and their leaders that they are not safe from the consequences of this, launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin nearly 2.5 years ago. Unfortunately for Ukraine, the Russians did not divert assets from eastern Ukraine to defend Kursk. Instead, the Russians have continued to move forward steadily in eastern Ukraine, and now they are closing in on the key city of Pokrovsk. And that means Russia's eastern offensive, which kicked off last fall and widened around the new year, has continued unimpeded through August. The consequences for Ukraine's defensive campaign in the east have been dire. In essence, Russia is trading Kursk for part of eastern Ukraine, and Ukraine is trading part of the east for Kursk. Whether either trade-off is worth it is a political question, and one without an easy answer for either side. The drumbeat of recent Russian advances east of Pokrovsk, northwest of Donetsk, should sound like an alarm in Kiev. On Friday, Russian infantry marched into Novohorodivka, 7 miles from Pokrovsk. Ukraine sent many of their best units, along with significant numbers of Western mercenaries, into Kursk, and so much of the front in eastern Ukraine is now defended by new conscripts that are very poorly trained. And as Kiev attempts to bask in triumph over its territorial gains inside of Russia, its forces are losing territory along the eastern front lines in Ukraine. Ukrainian military commanders say the reason for the losses is poorly trained soldiers. Many are even afraid to fire their own weapons. Now, speaking with the Associated Press, a battalion commander in Ukraine, 47th Brigade, said, "Some people don't want to shoot. They see the enemy in the firing position in trenches but don't open fire. That is why our men are victims, and when they don't use the weapon, they are ineffective." The decision to invade the Kursk region is turning out to be a massive strategic blunder. The Ukrainians have lost vast numbers of men and vehicles there, but they are not going to be able to hold Russian territory for very long. Meanwhile, the front in eastern Ukraine is at risk of completely collapsing. However, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continues to insist that the invasion of Kursk was part of his victory plan, quote unquote, which he will soon unravel to Joe Biden. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said his troops' incursion into Russian Kursk region is part of a victory plan he'll present to U.S. President Joe Biden next month. Speaking at a forum on Tuesday, President Zelensky said the success of the plan would depend on President Biden and on whether the U.S. would give Ukraine what is in this plan or not, and whether we will be free to use this plan or not, he said. It may sound too ambitious for some, but it is an important plan for us, he said, saying that he would also show the plan to both U.S. presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The only way the Ukrainians can possibly achieve victory is to get the U.S. and other Western powers directly involved in this conflict. So far, the Ukrainians have not been able to do that. But if that does happen at some point, that will bring us literally to the brink of nuclear conflict. Sadly, most people have no idea what a nuclear conflict would actually look like. According to author Annie Jacobson, the initial blast of one nuclear warhead in Washington, D.C. would immediately wipe out everything in a 9-mile diameter. So, with a 1 megaton bomb in Washington, D.C., what happens in the very first millisecond is that this thermonuclear flash expands into a ball of fire that is 1 mile of pure fire. It's 19 football fields of fire. When the fireball edges compress into what is called a steeply fronted blast wave, as dense wall of air pushing out, mowing down everything in its path 3 miles out in every direction, because it is accompanied by several 100-mile-an-hour winds. It's like Washington, D.C. just got hit by an asteroid and an accompanying wave, and when you think about this initial 9-mile diameter ring, imagine every single engineered structure, buildings, bridges, etc., collapsing. This is what one nuclear warhead would do. The Russians have thousands of them. Millions would be victims to this during a full-blown nuclear exchange between US and Russia, but billions would potentially die during the nuclear winter that follows. A nuclear war would plunge our planet into a deep nuclear winter. In the worst-case scenario, a nuclear exchange between the US and Russia, which together poses nearly 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, could eject up to 165 million tons of soot into Earth's atmosphere, reducing surface temperatures by 16 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 9 degrees Celsius, and sending global calorie production plummeting as much as 90%. We should do whatever it takes to avoid such a scenario, of course. If leaders on both sides were sane, they would sit down and try to talk things out while it's still possible to do so. Unfortunately, neither side is interested in talking at this point, and so we continue to steamroll towards the unthinkable. This is by Michael Snyder on the Economic Collapse blog. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. This is by Michael Snyder, about the author. Michael Snyder's extremely controversial new book, entitled Chaos is available in paperback and for Kindle on Amazon. He's also written 7 other books that are available on Amazon, including End Times, 7-Year Apocalypse, Lost Prophecies of the Future of America, The Beginning of the End, and Living a Life That Really Matters. When you purchase any of Michael's books, you help to support the work he's doing. You can also get his articles by email as soon as he publishes them by subscribing to his Substack newsletter. Michael has published thousands of articles on the Economic Collapse blog, End of the American Dream, and The Most Important News, and he always freely and happily allows others to republish those articles on their own websites. These are such troubled times and people need hope. John 3:16 tells us about the hope that God has given us through Jesus Christ. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. If you have not already done so, we strongly urge you to invite Jesus Christ to be your Lord and Savior today. Finally, support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.